Hey, good afternoon. This is Mark Osmak, and this is the third installment of Facebook Live for the Osmak for Congress campaign. And so we've had the past couple of weeks, or past 3 weeks, have some great dialogue and some questions. Today, we're going to be talking about minimum wage and how that combines with right to work, among other things. So in the previous week, we talked about guns and gun safety and gun violence, and that might come up again today. So the way it's going to work, just for the agenda, I'll start off by talking about right to work and minimum wage and what that is and what that means to Missourians and people in the 2nd Congressional District, and also how right to work, if it goes through this year in Missouri, how it's going to damage that, as well as just some general things on inflation and what we can do better as a state and as a nation and where I think we should go. And as with a lot of things, I try to base it on, of course, facts, but also personal experience. And so my history and the amount that I've earned and what I've been able to observe from the many different jobs I've had since I started. So my first job, just to let everyone know, I was at 14 and I worked as a golf caddy at Algonquin Golf Club. I knew nothing about golf. I still know nothing about golf, but so I caddied for a summer when I was 14, and the next year I got my job. I got a second job at McDonald's, and so this was in 1997. So I was 15 and a half at that time, and got a worker's permit. And so at the time in 1997, minimum wage was $4.75 an hour. So if I ever have kids, they're going to get really tired of me saying, you know how lucky you have it, which actually is not true if I had kids now, because the minimum wage is not kept up with inflation. But so in 1997, it was $4.75 an hour. The only raise that I got was when the federal government said, I think in February 1998, that's too little even for a 15-and-a-half-year-old. So they arrived at the very practical amount of $5.15 an hour. So that was the only increase, a 40-cent raise from McDonald's. So hooray. So when I talk about raising the minimum wage, it is a very personal thing for me because it is something that I have earned in the past and I know other people have as well. So when I speak about right to work or minimum wage or international affairs, it's not coming from some unknown place or simply just from reading what has happened in the past, but it's actually a personal thing that's impacted me. So one thing about minimum wage, I think a lot of people struggle with is, what is it? Right now in Missouri, it's a little bit higher than what the federal minimum wage is, but recently the State House and State Senate, the legislature here in Missouri, voted to turn down or to deny St. Louis, city of St. Louis, the requirement or the ability to increase the minimum wage just within the city limits. So to set, if you are a business within the St. Louis city limits, you are required to pay an increased amount. That initially went through, but then it was repealed. So it never actually, I think it was only in play for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or something like that. So imagine getting a pretty sizable, all things considered, a sizable raise per hour and then having that removed because the Missouri legislature said, no, that's too much. And you cannot require that to be paid in the city of St. Louis or Kansas City and not in the rest of the state. So why does that matter? Well, one question that I still don't understand is, regarding the minimum wage, why has it not increased with inflation? So I mentioned I made $4.75 an hour and increased to $5.15, which is a very strange number. But why, at the very least, can we not agree that minimum wage should be adjusted per year to increase for inflation? So as many people know, I spent 6.5 years in the active Army, and I'm still in the Army Reserves. And by the way, these comments, my thoughts, do not in any way, shape, or form reflect the views of the United States Army, Department of Defense, or Army Reserves. So why can we not have minimum wage being increased per year based on inflation, just like the military does? It's not going to do much, but it will let people know who are earning minimum wage that we do care, and that it is being adjusted for the cost of living that increases inherently every single year. So one question we have is, what do you think the minimum wage should be? Great question. Right now, there was a huge survey that was put through Missouri, and the initial question was, what do you think the minimum wage should be? And they set it at $15 an hour. And so I'm sure a lot of people have read or seen the hashtag Fight for 15 that a lot of fast food workers in the cities and other areas in Missouri have demanded and asked for. So there's a huge statewide survey, and the general consensus came back that $12 is what Missourians thought should be the minimum wage, and that would be done incrementally. So it's probably one of the biggest or best words I learned from George Washington University was incrementally, do it in steps. But that's over the course of 3 years. And so right now where we're at, and increasing that gradually to $12 an hour, and then hopefully more than that. So is the minimum wage a living wage? Right now, absolutely not. And so there's a step cost that a lot of people have broken out. So if you have no dependents, meaning no spouse, no children, that you would require to have this much per hour based on where you're living. So the cost of living in St. Louis, for instance, would be higher than if you were in a smaller rural community somewhere else in Missouri. And that's also true for New York City or Chicago or LA or those large metropolitan areas that do pay more to kind of keep up with the cost of living, but also because they need to attract quality workers, and that if they don't, somebody else will. So one way that right to work fits into this is that there's a quote that kind of gets used a lot, and I've said it, a rising tide raises all ships. So when unions set a new standard for monetary earnings per hour or for salary, it forces the rest of the economy and the rest of the industry to kind of compete with that. And so competition is typically very, very good, and it raises the wages of everybody else, because organizations or companies know that if we don't keep up with the unions, they might lose their skilled or trained workers to unions that will have a increased pay or increased health insurance. So for me, on a personal note, when I joined the local UFCW 655 here in St. Louis, my wages went up considerably. And I had, for the first time, health insurance or health coverage that I had never had before. So I took my first job at Deerberg's, I believe it was in 2001, and I worked at Deerberg's, Schnucks in St. Louis and Columbia, Missouri, and then also the real Busch Stadium number 2, and that was also a member of UFCW 655. So with that, there were standards, not only pay, not only in health insurance, but also in workers' rights. So OSHA is a direct response or direct correlation to, or has a direct correlation to unions. So OSHA helps set standards and what is safe and what is not safe for workers. And that could be in absolutely any industry. So when you're allowed to work, how often you're allowed to work, what hours. And so to make sure that people are not entering the workplace exhausted or in unsafe conditions. So unions do help keep an eye on that and raise the standard for everybody else, especially if you think in the building trades and construction trades. So those are going to be typically much more dangerous than working at a grocery store. Although people do get hurt at grocery stores, whether they fell or they slipped or they hurt their back lifting something. But so that's what that is. So the one thing I would do is, the first thing I would do when elected to Congress is to allow for wages to adjust for inflation. And then increase those every single year. The second one is to increase the wages per year. So I know some people, there's some pushback that, hey, if you're a 16-year-old kid or 17-year-old kid, 18-year-old kid, maybe you don't need that amount of money, or if you're a retiree. But that's pretty deceiving. And there's another way, there's like one area right above that, if you think of the data that's not being captured. So if the minimum wage is $7.25 or $7.80 or $9, let's just say hypothetically $9, you might not be making minimum wage, but you might be at $9.10. Or $9.15, and it's not to put down the 10-cent or 15-cent increase per hour, but it's really not going to make that much of a difference. And so when you do have, whether you're single or you do have kids, cost of living is extremely expensive. And the bottom line, to kind of wrap this up kind of tightly, and this isn't I'm not the only person to say this, but that if you're working 40 hours a week, you should not be living in poverty or below the poverty line. And the simple, irrefutable fact is that if you are earning minimum wage now, working full-time 40 hours a week, you are below the poverty line. And that is absolutely unacceptable. Anybody who's working that often should not be struggling to wonder, how am I going to pay bills? How am I going to live in this apartment or wherever my housing is? How am I going to afford food? How am I going to pay for gas, insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But I want to bring up something else too, and that is a concept called access to the common good. And I've spoken quite a bit about this. Minimum wage is a part of it. It's not all of it though. So kind of a typical attack that a lot of Democrats receive, the Democratic Party receives, is that we just try to throw money at problems. And to some extent, I agree with that. And so I think raising the minimum wage is a part of it, as far as increasing quality of life throughout the entire United States, but also increasing access to what I would call common goods. So very quick story, the state of Tennessee has eliminated the cost of tuition for those native Tennesseans who are attending a community college. The so what of that is, if you're a Tennessean, you can go to school for free, even though it's not free, it's tax paid. The downside is, I don't think the amount that people are paying for tuition at a community college is what keeps a lot of people from going. I think it's two big things. I think it's transportation and childcare. So transportation and childcare, I think, are the larger barriers to entry of people attending, whether it's a trade school or going to community college or a standard or a typical university or college. It's typically that. So if you are, unless you're a single person with no kids, no dependents, it is very difficult because a lot of these classes are typically in the evenings. They cater to working adults. It is very difficult to find someone to, if you do have kids, to watch your children, and also how do you get there. And so the less sexy part of this is what can we do to increase public transportation, and what can we do to increase access to childcare. And those two things cost money, yes, but they also increase jobs. They also create a demand for how are we going to increase the number of buses or light rail or subways, whatever it is, depending on where we're at geographically in the United States. But those are the two, I really do think, and data backs it up, those are the two main hurdles for people continuing education. So one of the things I would do, yep, I would definitely increase the minimum wage, allow the market to adjust, allow essentially the entire economy to adjust, because if you do it overnight, it'll be quite the shock to the system. But to have a prolonged benefit to the United States and those earning money, I think we should increase the minimum wage, but also increase access to the common good, to the common good, and that includes transportation and childcare. So some of those things, though, people have difficulty in getting into childcare because there aren't enough childcare workers. So what can we do to address that? Well, one of the questions I've asked is, why does a social work major at a university pay the exact same amount as a business major? And I'm not at all saying that someone pursuing a business degree is wrong or bad or not as important. It's simply that the return on investment is going to be much, much different. Simply stated, a business major is going to stand to earn a lot more annually than someone who has a social work degree. So I think if we lower the cost of degrees in education for those who are getting a social work degree, an education degree, for lack of a better term, an altruistic degree, I think we can actually start to address the supply and demand issue on that. So the more people that are going to be entering universities or schools or colleges to pursue social work or education degrees, we can start to see the demand and supply start to really meet each other and lower the disparity between the two extremes. So $12 I support. I do think it should be more. For those who say, so 15 is what I would support and do support. For those who say this is going to backfire, companies cannot afford it, that's nonsense. Look at how much CEOs and high members of people and staffs make at a company like McDonald's or like Burger King. They're not struggling for money. And I forget how much it exactly is per hour, but I think it's between $5,000, $7,000, or $9,000. I think it was like $7,000 to $9,000 an hour is what the McDonald's CEO makes. So if he or she is making that amount of money, I think we can do a little bit better as far as the people that are actually working the jobs. Whether they're taking orders or working in the kitchen at McDonald's. And I say this again as someone who used to work at McDonald's, but that just comes to priorities. But it's a scare tactic that a lot of, or some companies or organizations will say, hey, if you increase this, we're not going to be able to afford workers and we'll have to close it down or move overseas. It's simply not true. Another concern is if we do this, if we do increase the minimum wage, that will incentivize companies to have more automated work. Look, the truth is companies are going to automate anyway. They are not automating because they like paying people X number per hour. It's quite the opposite. If there is a way for a business or corporation to pay less, they will. That's their profit-driven entities, and that's what their purpose is. So if the minimum wage increases, it's not going to close down more places. It's actually the opposite. People have more money to spend, which is what I know a lot of Republicans are very involved in and kind of tout a bit. But the more money people make per hour, the more money they're going to have to spend. So I think those are the best ways to go about it and address it. One question is, corporations just got a tax break, so they should be able to afford it. Absolutely. And someone else said they claim that trickle-down works. It does not work. There's a great little picture that if you type in trickle-down economics and click on images, hopefully nothing bad comes up. But you're going to see what some people think is just a row of cups or champagne glasses that are in pyramid form and that it all flows down evenly. The fact of the matter is that's not what happens. Whenever you do, the reality of trickle-down is the cup at the top gets bigger, and there's actually less and less going down. So that does not work. As far as the comment on tax breaks, yes, and also bonuses. Here's the damn inconvenience about the bonus theory. So I know President Trump and a lot of members in the Republican Party are touting how many bonuses people are getting. The reality of it is that when you get a bonus, it's taxed higher than if you had an increase in salary or hourly wage. So it's strange and it's backwards almost to celebrate having a bonus as a result of these tax breaks when that bonus is taxed at a higher rate than if you had an increase in salary or wage. So it doesn't, in the long term or even medium term, it doesn't do what some economists on the Republican side or Republicans think would happen, and that is if you have a bonus of $500 or $1,000, that you're going to generate that, you're going to put it right back into the economy. What happens is people typically, like me and others, they typically take that bonus and they use it to pay bills, or they use it to put it in a savings account. That's it. So neither of those things really stimulate the economy. If you truly want to stimulate the economy, if there's a requirement for higher wages and a higher standard of living, that is a much more prolonged and long-term solution to this. Someone else said it didn't work with President Reagan. Nope, it didn't, and it hasn't yet. And if it hasn't worked since the 80s, I don't anticipate it changing the next 30 years to come. So bottom line, to summarize, increase the minimum wage, absolutely. Missouri has said we want to increase it to $12 incrementally. I agree. I don't think that's enough. I am staunchly against right to work because I and my family members, my uncle was a carpenter in a union. We have benefited, and a lot of other people have benefited by the strength of unions. And if you look at right to work states, particularly in the South, it hurts them. They earn less per hour. Their wages go down. The quality of life goes down. The security and health in the workplace goes down. And those people are going to start to leave, if they can, those states for other states. So right to work is completely wrong, not just for Missouri. What we need to do is come up with a better way, a better term. Republicans are very, very, very good at naming things, and Democrats kind of not. So I'm an English major, so if anybody has any ideas on what to call a better name instead of just increasing the minimum wage, send me an email. I'm at mark@markosmac.com. You can probably see how I spell my name there. And my phone number is area code 314-482-2911. I want to thank everyone for their great questions and their comments today. The only reason these things are 15 minutes is not because I can't talk for longer. God knows I could go on for another hour, but just keep them as tight and concise as possible. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more discussions going on. I just want to take a momentary pause from the gun violence issue, which I've been very outspoken about on Twitter and Facebook, and emails have gone out this week. But next week, I hope you and invite your friends and family members, and make sure to invite them. I will see you next week, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. And shameless plug, if you like what you hear, like what you see, go to markosmac.com. Click on issues. I think it's very, very, very important that we know where our elected officials stand on issues, or the candidates. So if a candidate says something that seems very, very vague and blasé, see what they say. Just do a Google search. Go to their website, and if they don't have it on there, let them know. It's one thing, I always say, it's one thing to speak in platitudes and theories. It's another thing to actually put your name behind it. So my name is behind fully just getting rid of right to work in Missouri and throughout the nation. It's fully behind increasing the minimum wage to $12 and then $15 an hour. But it's also completely behind addressing what I think is the true issue in this, and that is increasing access to common goods to include healthcare, education, transportation. So thank you all very much. Hope you all have a good Thursday. Any questions, send me a message, and I will see you here, same time, same place next week. Thanks a lot.